looking at the camera.
Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Escape Velocity. I'm your host, Tracey Halvorsen with Adeo, and today I am really excited to be talking to Brigid Lawler, who is an enrollment professional, worked in higher ed for a long time, very passionate about this space, has seen a lot of things come and go. And right now, we've been working together briefly and just want to talk about how breakthroughs have worked, how you find them, how you when you need them, how you get a team to embrace them. And meanwhile, Brigid, thanks for joining. And if you'd like to kind of cover a little bit more about yourself, now's your time.
Yeah, I mean, I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to have a chat with you. Um, we had a great chat when you first started thinking about working with the last school I was at, and I really enjoyed the conversation there, and glad that we have a chance to kind of extend it. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I've spent about 30 some odd years in higher ed on both sides, right? I was on the student services side and career services, and then crossed over to admissions, and have just seen a lot of really interesting things happen over the years. And it's always been an interesting time. But it is particularly interesting now. Um, yeah, that's that's I am a person who I think maybe doesn't always fit the mold of enrollment. uh, I really love the idea of small little places that are scrappy and do things different. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and just trying to come up with creative ways to really highlight all the things that each place has. It breaks my heart when I think about small schools that are not going to make it, because those are great places. And it's just the landscape, it makes it so tough for them. Anyway, rabble, ramble, ramble, ramble.
No, not at all. I think, I also have worked in higher education from the agency side
Yep.
for, I guess, 25 years now. And my background is in the creative arts and really in creative expression that then really moved into the digital space when that all kind of started happening back in the late 90s. And we started working with higher eds, not necessarily on purpose. And I remember thinking, one of our very first clients was Delaware College of Art and Design. Now, this was a long time ago, but I remember when we showed the president some of the original design ideas, his main concern was that we had used photos of students who had hats on, and he wasn't comfortable with that. And I thought, you are the president of an art school. What is going on? And I think that was an early indicator that, you know, a, I'm still working with organizations that have been around for a long time. And over time, any company, organization, group, it can fall into historical thinking, legacy thinking, processes start to kick in, and there's not necessarily a change plan. It becomes reactionary at worst. At best, there is a forward thinking leadership team in place in any of these situations. And what I loved as I continued to work with higher eds is that the ones who started coming to us and working with us wanted to think differently. They wanted to think outside the box. They knew they needed to. They knew that their brand could back it up, and they had the internal support to do it. And that led to fantastic projects with Bucknell and Yale and Brown and big name schools, and also some really great little schools that you may have never heard of, but they still had that need and that desire to push the envelope and really differentiate themselves by doing so. What I think is interesting is that even in my old agency, over time, our processes started to become redundant. And I started to see, oh, we're becoming a company that, just kind of runs through the grinder on this stuff. And, when we talked and you talked about some of the other groups you could work with, it was like you didn't want that. Um, I've been thankful for the last 5 years where I've gotten to spend, work on a startup. I'm working in emerging markets. I'm working in places in politics, where you've got to move fast. You have to differentiate. You've got to pay attention to what the polls are saying, what the audiences are saying, what the consumers are saying. And so it's been refreshing to be able to bring that thinking to Adeo. And when we were starting to work together, it was very clear that that was an idea that you felt very strongly needed to be part of the work we did together. Um, but it is a challenge, right? It is a challenge to break those habits. How do you make people suddenly get passionate and feel like they can take risks and, you've got your jobs on the line? Um,
I think you touch on some really great points. And one in particular is, or you alluded to, I think, is I think institutions tend to have an idea of who they think they are. And I'm not always 100% sure that they are accurate, right? They have ideas about who their students are or who their competition is, right? And they get sort of stuck. And it may have been, right? Like that may have been what it was,
yeah.
right? But the landscape is ever changing, right?
Mhm.
And the same for your prospective student, right?
Right.
I think again, there is no one size, right? Like people will say to me, nobody wants a view book. View books are dead. And I think to myself, are they? Are pardon me, but crappy run of the mill dime a dozen view books dead? Yup. They've always been dead, right? But I think I look at a generation of people who have been so tied into technology, who are actually craving tactile, right? Like those things that they can actually like look and touch and feel or whatever. And so it's like, how do you take something that is so old and run of the mill and has the potential to be expensive and useless and make it something that is a differentiator? That's one example. I also think we have this tendency to say, oh, Gen Zers are this, or Gen Zers want this, or Gen Zers want that. When in fact, I think part of the challenge is they're all over the place,
Yeah.
right? Um, I remember taking my one of my step monsters. She was a junior, right? And her dad, Canadian, no experience with the college search process. It was great for me, right? Because I had this opportunity to kind of go out and see what was going on. And I remember when we started the process, she was so fixated on the physical space, right? She wanted to know, like, what were the dorms going to look like? And what was the campus like? And what was it close to? And even down to like the food in the rooms. And it wasn't until like that maturation, right? Like that process of starting when she was young, like right when she, became a junior that spring, and watching how that really morphed into a value proposition. How much is this going to cost? How much is it going to cost my family? Do they have the program that I'm interested in? Or I don't know what I'm interested in. Are they a place where I'm going to be able to figure that out? Right. Um, so I think that all of those things really presents a challenge for enrollment when you're trying to figure out how do you market, how do you find um, how do you find that top of the funnel that's actually really going to yield for you, right?
Yeah.
um, yeah.
It's interesting too. Higher ed, uh, being so, traditional and kind of stuck in its ways. And I agree. It can, I think for anyone, the longer you're staring in the mirror, and the closer you get, the harder it is to really see the full picture. So But the other challenge is that, the majority of them, they are marketing themselves to this very elusive demographic because their their preferences, their desires are kind of emerging. They're not fully defined. College is a defining moment in most people's lives where they have that time to fully kind of develop into what will, be a more fully formed human eventually. Um, but none of it is kind of locked in stone, and they all do come from, everybody comes from different backgrounds and has different concerns. And I think, you have to kind of throw your lasso around a few of them and make some generalizations about what those concerns are or preferences. But they don't want to be spoken to as if you've lumped them in and you're speaking to a target demographic or a Gen Z. Um, so it's a really great challenge, and I think it's, look, brands like Nike and all the other ones, how many millions of dollars a year do they spend on market research trying to understand this particular age group and what motivates them to, get their parents to buy them a expensive pair of sneakers. And we're talking about a lot more than a pair of Air Jordans.
Well, and
Um,
it's interesting, right? You bring up the parents, right? Because now in higher ed, I mean, depending on the demographic, parents have been involved to a certain extent, or whatever. But I'm fascinated by how much you have to have a really two-pronged approach, right? The one that
mhm.
is going to appeal to the prospective student, but then also how are you appealing to the parent and how that changes by demographic, right? From a first gen parent to, somebody who has had experience with college, has, come from different backgrounds, and how much now, um, again, young folks are actually okay with their parents being a part of the process, right?
Yeah.
I can remember that not being the case, that was not even in fact, it was almost a almost a deterrent, right? Like if it was the school that your parents really loved, there was a tendency to go in the complete total opposite direction. But now, you really, when you're building out your marketing and your branding and your whatever those com flows look like, you have to have an almost an entirely, um, I don't want to say different, but you do have to be looking at how do you morph what you're doing to appeal to those different segments of who your market actually is, and the parents are a big part of that.
Yeah, and it's tough too because I think a lot of kids are heading into college not knowing what they want to do with their lives, right? And so then they're going to the parents saying, I want to go here, I want to look at this school, um, I want to study these things, I think, but this place will give me, time to figure that out. And as a parent, you're like, well, what are you likely to do with your life if you go here? Like let's just look at some possible outcomes. Even and it's like you almost have to give the script to the kid to say like, and hand this part to your parent or your guardian or whoever's worried about 10 years down the road when you can't even think past next month in terms of your life's ambitions. You're still kind of working on a much shorter timeline typically.
And it is very much demographically based, right? I know, I was working at a state school in Massachusetts, and it was, the state liberal arts college. And the market was a lot of first generation kiddos,
Yeah,
or transfer students. And that idea of taking the time to choose something, particularly in the liberal arts vein, was really considered quite a luxury by some of these, folks who were like, no, you will go here, you are okay to go here as long as you are doing something that is perceived as a good field to go into where there are good
Right.
jobs, et cetera, right? And you'd read the application and think to yourself, oh my goodness, no, this person should not be going in this direction. They should be going in this direction. And so, how do you create that space where folks who have not had that experience, or for whom it is a luxury, right, understand um, that there's so many things that you can do if you create a space to be an agile thinker, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, I
yes.
think higher ed has struggled with showing the value of the liberal arts education in general. I think that now is a very unique time in the history of human evolution where I think that you can make the case that nothing else matters. Um, when we have so much change and so much disruption, that thinking, critical thinking, communication skills, creative thinking, um, exposure to lots of different, cultures and learning areas of academic research, whatever it might be. The liberal arts right now is like, yeah, that's what we need, everybody to get really good at that. Um,
I think also the challenge has been, and where liberal arts schools have sort of shot themselves in the foot a bit, is um, it shouldn't be an either or, like one is better than the other, right?
right.
Like there is a tremendous amount of value to knowing what you want to do, to choosing to go to a state school, right?
Hmm.
I think somehow the conversation became a one is better than the other. And I'm not 100% sure that that has done anybody any favors, right? Because there's a specific market for each, right? Like there are many, I've come across many students who do actually know what they want to do and who do not waver, right? And or who for whom that larger state school experience has been great. And so I always am fascinated by this. I've seen liberal arts colleges do it. I've seen state schools do it, where they sort of denigrate the other, like they speak almost disparagingly of the other. And I think, no, no, there's room for everybody. It's
Yeah.
more a question of, who's gonna thrive in an environment, or who's gonna be most successful in whatever environment. And, you know, um, I think that was always pretty interesting, right? And again, cost is so compelling. Um, I saw the last school I was at, looking at the information about crossover applications and seeing that for the first time, or for the first time in the school's real history, the top 10 crossovers were state institutions.
Hmm.
Now, again, how do you compete with that when your printed price tag is significantly higher, right? How do you have those conversations with students about what are they actually paying, right? Like, so there's so many things. I don't Did you see that article recently? It was in the Times, and it was somebody who was talking about Syracuse, and they were talking about, used very strong language, the word poaching, about how Syracuse,
Oh, I
uh,
did read that. Yes.
as of May 2nd, right, was suddenly reaching out to all of these kiddos that they had admitted who didn't accept, and offering them more money. And I had to really chuckle to myself and think, this has been going on for a very long time, right? Like the tone of the article almost made it sound like it was something that was new. And I thought, no, it's new for Syracuse, right? Schools like Syracuse have probably never really been in that situation before. And now they find themselves there. But so many small schools, you there's a couple of things there, right? First of all, students don't tell you where they're going. So you're constantly like bombarding them with messaging, right? Because hope lives. You think, well, maybe they're going to go to an admitted student day and it's going to be like not what they wanted. And then they're going to be like, oh, you know what? Yes, I will come here. Or, unfortunately, for many in enrollment, you don't want to have to go out on the in the 11th hour and say here's more money, right? Like the plan should be, how do you have those conversations up front in January, in February, I would even say in the fall, right? How do you have conversations with people about affordability and merit awards, right? Like the fact that Syracuse was having those conversations after May 1, I kind of thought a couple of things. Poor Syracuse. But also, it was such an interesting article because I felt like the tone of it was like as if this was a new thing. And I wanted to chime in and say, no, it's a new thing for schools that have never had to struggle like this, but it's quite an old, um, unpopular practice for a lot of schools that are really like having to like slog it out all the way up until the actual start of class, right?
Yeah.
Number of schools that are making their class by May 1 smaller and smaller. And
Yeah.
so,
I mean, it's tough. It's challenging times for
oh,
sure.
incredibly challenging.
Um, there's a lot of compression happening. You've got, just the enrollment cliff. I guess we're heading off of it. But I don't even think that's the biggest issue as much as it's the negative conversations about the value. Uh,
About value, about return on investment,
yeah.
about, yeah, there's so much to, it's like somebody described it to me as a big ball of Christmas lights that's just completely tangled. It's pretty, it's sparkly, but man, is it a pain to like sort of unravel and figure out like how do you get in front of it, right? I
Yeah,
look at
and it's so expensive for many, or it requires so much debt to be taken on, and there have been so many conversations about how crippling that can actually be. So, why would you put your child or yourself in a situation where you're setting yourself up for failure, not success?
well,
And, it's hard for people to make sense of that.
and I think part of the struggle, or like in my head where I've gone, is I've always thought to myself, okay, I'm somebody who is attending a very expensive institution, right? Whether it's state or private, whatever. And I want to be, I'm going to pick on sociology. I want to become a social worker. I want to become a sociologist, whatever that looks like, right? Well, it may be a good idea to take a look at what is the earning potential and what is the education requirement for somebody to enter into that field, right? If you want to become a licensed social worker, unless it's changed, you needed a master's, right? You need to pursue a master's degree. Well, your salary, even with that master's degree, what is the income? What is the income for that? So there's nobody sort of, not even sort of, there's nobody having these conversations with folks early on about, if you choose to go to school here and you choose to pursue this particular field, you will need to do this and it is going to cost you this, but you will likely make this. Like there's no real conversation about that cost benefit analysis, right?
Yeah.
I had a student at state school say to me, I chose to come here because I knew I was going to have to get a master's and I knew that that was going to cost me significantly more. So I chose to come here for undergrad because I knew I'd get a good education, I'd have a good experience, and then I wouldn't be so over my head for grad. That to me is like was mind blowing, right? It was like a thoughtfulness about the next step, right? About, to your point earlier, when parents are like, what will you do with this? And what will it cost you? And to do something with it, how much education do you have? And what will it look like to continue? So
Well, you know who has, I mean, I saw in your background you did work for an arts institution for a while.
Very, very briefly, yes, but that was enlightening.
Yeah, you know, because I think of all the people that have the hardest sell when it comes to outcomes and showing like, okay, you know, if you say you want to be an artist,
Right.
there literally aren't that many good outcomes to even look to. Um, and I think it's been really interesting to see how art schools have been addressing this. Um, you know, in their content and in the reality that most people don't go on to, if they're not teaching, don't necessarily go on to have professional fine art careers. But they might leverage their creative thinking in all sorts of interesting and entrepreneurial ways that I've always felt was kind of a storyline that had a lot of angles to it. What was your take? What was your take on it?
A lot of angles and a lot of, I think, to your point, missed opportunities, you know. The creative side of things is everywhere. There is no business that doesn't require those skills, right?
Yeah,
And so I think, yeah, it is more about how do you have that conversation about all of the things, all of the different folks that are working in these different types of occupations who have come from this background, right? And how this background lends itself um, to, you know, so much of what drives uh, what you see in the media, right? Or gosh, everything you pick up has an artist attached to it, right? Or creative, some sort of creative aspect to it. So it's really just how do you explain that? How do you make that conversation happen, and how do you also help students to understand like the likelihood that you are going to be able to make your living initially through your art solely. um, maybe Maybe not, you know, but like, how do you have those conversations about what are the other things that you can do, right? How, you know,
yeah. It's a universal. I mean, creativity is a universally needed, but under
valued,
undervalued for sure, and I think misunderstood um, characteristic or trait or whatever it might be. You know, I do think we are all creative, but to our points earlier in this conversation, it gets kind of seen as a threat because the act of creation means new.
right?
So if you are just like, no, we are going to do it the way we've always done it, we are going to think the way we've always thought, and nothing new, nothing's going to change, that is not where you are going to have any kind of creative thinking. And so I think there's some there's some need there. You know, I think it just even in our society for there to be an understanding of how creativity impacts positive outcomes because everything is changing whether we want it to or not.
And when you do something that is unique and different, right? It rarely fails. Um, it's just a question of patience, right? It's a question of people having patience to understand that things that are creative are often not a quick fix, right? It's
Yeah, not a quick fix. That's why you don't want to like leave it for the end when you're in dire straits and you suddenly think, we'll just get really creative with this one thing and it'll pull us out of our whatever situation we're in. But I also think that uh, I think people are naturally um, fearful of others having opinions about their brand or their marketing or their messaging or their company or themselves. And when you do good creative work, it's not it's unique. It stands on its own. It's memorable and it has a point of view. And that's going to, not everyone is going to love it, you know, but you want everyone to have an opinion, whether it's a, hey, this is amazing, or, oh, this is not for me. This is horrible. I think a lot of people would rather just stay right in the middle than risk that kind of scrutiny, because then you do have to be really clear about whose voices matter. Um,
And that's what it all sort of distills down to, right? It comes back around to that whole idea about who is making the decisions and whose voice, right? And so often, particularly in higher ed, the folks um, who are making the decisions or who have the say, um, innovative, creative, something that goes too far from what their idea of the place is, it's very difficult to kind of throw yourself out there. When I was working at Marlborough College, they did this great rebranding view book. It was still, to this day, I look at it and I go, oh my gosh, like how they captured this place. But there was endless conversation and back and forth because it was the focus of the campaign was physical, like visual faces, right? And there was this individual who had a piece of blue gum that you could see, and the amount of conversation about the blue gum, and that you didn't want the blue gum, and it was just, you know that's we the blue gum was Marlboro. Right? Like, that was the kid, that was the student, that was the individual, and um, it was hard for some folks who came from a different background, who maybe had been when it was a different place, but I also think who were at different points in their lives, right? That is a huge challenge because so many of us in higher ed, we're older, and what we think is good or works or is right. I know I'm guilty of this, right? The stuff that I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing. Somebody young might look at that and be like, no, it really isn't, you know? Um, and so that's the challenge, right? Is how do you stay fresh and current, and um, how do you keep testing those boundaries when you yourself start to just get very fixated on that stuff that appealed to you, right? Like, yeah.
yeah, and also like there's a, I mean, how many schools, especially right now, can afford to go through the revisions on, to update their brand and messaging, to redo all their materials, to redo their website. You're talking, historically speaking, that would be years and heading towards $1 million, and a lot of people's time. And it would just be a tremendous amount of effort. And so you needed these things to be almost as timeless as possible. Um, and I think there's a pressure there to like, well, let's not make it too unique, because what if then, we got to redo it in 2 years, or I don't know.
Well, that's it, right? How do you also keep things somewhat ever clear? That's a challenge.
Yeah.
um, but also, what I think is so challenging is that so many schools are spending so much money on their on a reliance on large, I have to be careful, on large companies that are basically just sending out the same stuff, right? Like, you could look at things and go, "Up, I know which company did this. Up, I know which company did that." When if they And again, it's a challenge because bandwidth, right? Not even so much financial bandwidth, but bandwidth, like the people to actually do the work when you want to bring it in house.
Yeah.
Um, that is the constant, push me, pull me. Um, Personally, if you're a small place, I think you have a much better outcome when you are working with a young, not a younger, but with like a firm that is doing a lot of different creative things, right? Because they are going to look at you with a fresh set of eyes, and they're going to come at things in a different way. And so the money that you spend there versus really a significant amount of money that you spend handing it over to someone else. I just have never seen that work for small places, right?
Yeah.
Just, there's no affinity building, there's no um, really taking the time for discovery to understand, like, who are you, and like there's always talk of the funnel, right?
Mhm.
Everybody wants a huge top of the funnel. Well, yeah, of course, because you're not yielding, because you're spending so much time throwing the spaghetti against the wall that you're not finding the people who are going to yield. To me, an enrollment funnel should be somewhat straight, right? It's not about so much at the top, it's about how much are you actually yielding, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're doing it right, your funnel should be straighter.
I mean, that's a great point. And, you know, I know that with a lot of those bigger agencies, you're getting people who maybe have a couple years experience and they don't want to lose their jobs.
Yep.
So they're going to look at, well, what's worked for somebody else? What was deemed good work by somebody like this client? And that's probably what I'm going to lean towards. So, I do think it's hard to be sure that the team that is going to be working with you is going to, truly be trying to take those swings, and do the research and build the affinity and understand all of the nuances that each small place is so unique.
I
But
had somebody say to me once about a bigger company, well, you just really have to watch them. You have to keep, your hands in, and you have to do the work. And in my head, I thought, then why am I not just doing it myself? Like, why am I writing the check for this, Because really what you just said is it's almost more work,
yeah,
because the
can be.
amount of time and energy that goes into making sure that you are not just getting the template, you know. You could have you could have spent that time and energy, you know, just doing your own thing. But it's scary because if there's one little slip, if there's one little pause in those communications going out or in any step, the effect is really, it's significant. Uh, and so that fear is real. And people who have experienced the hiccup when they've moved from one place to another, one company to another, that fear is real, and the impact is, it's hard to come back from. So I get it, I understand, but at the same time, yeah, it's interesting, right? Enrollment people, I'm always fascinated when you tell them like how much you do in enrollment. It's marketing and communications, it's financial aid, it's retention, should be, right? Like you have to be just doing everything, and yeah.
And then, how much internal leadership and guidance are you having to do too to align your internal stakeholders with whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish to, towards an eye towards enrollment. Sometimes those things can be at odds.
Yeah, they can definitely be at odds, and it's also always interesting to me how I think people really underestimate or overestimate how much they think they know about enrollment, and how there is this assumption that it can't possibly be that hard, right? If everybody just works a little harder, if everybody just visits a few more schools, or right, or it's just it is one of those places where everybody feels a bit like they have the ability to sort of weigh in. Um, and while you want that, right, you want to create that collective, you want to create that environment where everybody feels like they're a part of it. um, I think, it's challenging sometimes, to just have a conversation with people about what is a funnel and what is the cycle of admission, right? Because I've had can't tell you how many times I've had people say to me, well, but you still have June, July, and August. Like, no, you do, but you don't, right?
Yeah.
Like, your class is made the January before that class, right? Like, or not even further down, right? Like, so January of 2025, you are basically setting the tone and building out what your fall 2026 class is going to look like.
Now, this leads me to a question, right? Which is, so you've got all these metrics that drive all of this. You've got the deadlines. You've got all the, early decision and all these things that the kids are trying to weigh. Um, do you? And I agree. Nobody understands it, and it's such a long tail, long game, and we've got to contend with these stealth applicants, right? The people that you don't know, like
Oh my
they're going to
God.
just show up, and you're going to be like, "Where'd they come from?"
Right.
So, I mean, how do you work with so much unknown in that kind of space when you're trying to go? Are we going to make our numbers here? Are we going to have a good class?
And then there's the Christmas lights. I mean, there's things that you can do, right? Like, you can back out your funnel. You can look at, okay, how historically have we yielded? Where have we yielded from? And that's part of it. Then there is, where is the potential for new? How do we get there? How do we leverage not having the ability to physically be in places? How do you use third party vendors to get your message out? um, how do you use social media in a way, right, like that is that the statistics now for our kids, how they want their messaging, like majority of them want it through it, like they want it through
TikTok, yeah,
TikTok or Instagram, right? Like they don't,
or YouTube, yeah.
right. And so, there's so much, but do their parents want that communication? No. So again, it's like you're building out um, all of these different mechanisms. Throw into the mix transfer populations or non-traditional students, right?
Yeah,
It
international students, yeah.
Yes, and
So,
international is interesting so much so this year, right? Because for schools that have doubled down, very aggressively on international students, mm, that could be why we'll see many schools not hit who normally hit their numbers.
yeah, I think a lot of schools don't openly discuss the fact that international students do not qualify for aid, so they are all full pay. So there's a big bag of cash coming with each one of those international students, you know, and that's fine. It's great when this is such a destination for education, and research and all of that. But now, and let alone will they even be allowed in?
Will they be allowed in? And so interesting, right? Schools that meet full need. So think about that.
Yeah.
So a school that meets full need is incredibly popular with international students, of
Mhm.
course, right? And that also inflates your numbers when it comes to selectivity,
Mhm.
because you could have over 2,500 international applications, and because you're meeting need, you're only going to be able to admit maybe like a really small class size of like 50. So you've now just, right? Like think about your selectivity, because nobody's disaggregating from that selectivity, right?
Yeah.
Those international applicants who you're never going to admit them. They're not going to come, right? Because you can only do um right, like you can only do so much, right? Small numbers.
Right.
So there's so much there. And yeah, right. Like if you're a school, like if you're a research institution where like your significant number is coming from, you're going to hit it. You're going to feel it this year, I think. It
Yeah.
seems like.
Yeah. I guess we'll see. It does just feel there's so much turmoil in higher ed in the last 5, 6 years. I mean, there were times when I was like, whew, I'm glad I'm not trying to solve those problems right now. Uh, it's, and I guess I'm a glutton for punishment because I'm back right at like the juiciest point in the storyline. Um, but it is a incredible, and I love solving complicated problems, and this is a complicated one. Um, I'm just curious, as we kind of near the end of this session, like when have you seen groups or teams or individuals have the ability and go ahead and do something really different and have it work?
I mean, I know when I was at Marlboro, we we were struggling wildly, and it was this whole notion of a needle in a haystack. You knew that there were kids out there that would be perfect. Keep saying kids, students, right? That would be perfect for the place, but it was like, how do you find them? And I was really fortunate in that there was just trustees and president and faculty, because it was such a intentional place, that we were able to start a program. It was the Renaissance Scholars Program, and it was also this program called Beautiful Minds. And it was an institution that was like, okay, how do we take how do we find the essence of who we are, and we build these programs around it, right?
Mhm.
And so not only are we going to find the student who this is going to appeal to, but we're also going to find the student who's going to be successful here, right?
Yeah.
And how do you change the culture of the place? And we would have town meeting every week, and I remember everybody knew what the goal was, and we did this exercise called Who Do You Know? And it was everybody. We were like, who knows somebody in Wisconsin, and who knows somebody in Michigan? And it became everybody's job to recruit and to find those students, right? And that was really, to me, that was like such a great moment, because it was just the collective, right? It was everybody understood that admissions was everybody's job, right? Nobody is coming to a school because I'm effervescent. They might be attracted to that initially, but they're coming to a school because I'm making an assumption that I'm effervescent, but they're coming to a place because they want to study with you, right? Or they want to be in a classroom with you, or they see you as their potential best friend, right? Or they see, and so I think that that is so crucial. And that was, again, one of those instances where I just felt like I was very fortunate in that moment, to have people buy into this scheme, and to really become to go from an to go from a place where we would have enrollment events and nobody was there except admissions, to 4 years later having an open house that was current students, faculty, spouses, family, prospective students, families. It was just this amazing experience. It makes me sad that, Marlboro couldn't hang in there, right? But you could see how that is really what has always driven me, and I think has attracted me to small places, is that idea that you build this collaboration between the entire institution. Everybody in the fall should know, what is the goal? What's our enrollment goal? And the admissions folks should be reporting back to faculty, staff, the entire campus regularly. Here's where we are in terms of our number of applications. Here's where we are in terms of our number of deposits. Almost like I always joke about a t-shirt. I want a t-shirt with the number on it, just the number, so that everybody is on board and gets it, right? Like, um yeah, I can totally become the person who is just a little bit of the Kool-Aid drinker when it comes to that. Bad expression, not supposed to use that, but anyway, right? Like, that is the stuff that when that fires and it's working, you're like, yes, because at the end of the day, I'm assuming people are working at an institution because they really believe in the mission, they love the institution, they believe in it, but they also never lose sight of what is the purpose. It is, you are going to change this person's life. This is the first major decision that a young person makes, where they're going to work, who their friends are, who their partners are or aren't, right? All builds from where they go to school. And to have people, really, it's an honor for a student to even visit your campus because of all of the places that they could go to get them to choose to come to your home, right? You can't lose sight of that. And even if it's not the right fit for them, to be able to say, like, yeah, this probably isn't for you, but maybe you should think about this place, right? That whole Gimbel's Macy's sort of a thing, where at the end of the day, when you say to a parent, I just want them to find a place where they're going to fit and land and feel great, that should be the end game. And I think sometimes you get so caught up in the numbers not being there and the net tuition revenue and all of that, understandably, right? Because it's the survival of the school. But I think sometimes it's easy to lose sight of what the mission is, right? Why are we doing this? Why are we in this? And it's because you believe in the transformative power of an institution, of a place, right?
Yeah. I think
Uh,
it's hard. I think it's so hard for people to get into that mindset, especially when they're fearful, when they're in a place of reaction and defensiveness, and they're scared about what's going to happen. It's not where your best thinking is going to happen, or your risk taking, or your lens shifting, like what it sounds like Marlboro was, from grassroots and changing kind of the culture, or really embracing the culture and turning it inside out, so that you allowed all those bundle of Christmas lights to shine out in through these lenses that aligned at least with what you could do at Marlboro. Um, Sounds
yeah.
like it was a great experience to go through that, and that does take time and leadership, and it's got to start from the inside, right?
Yeah, and trust, right? Like,
Yeah,
people need to
absolutely.
trust you know, that you're I mean, again, I've been at places where people have said, "Don't talk about the numbers. Don't tell anybody what the numbers are." And I'm like, "Okay, if you're like me, if you don't tell me, I instinctively go to the worst place possible." That's just my nature, right? You don't tell me what it is, I'm like,
It
"It's
must be really bad.
right? You're not telling me because it's terrible."
Right.
Uh, and 9 out of 10 times, that is the that is the reason. So, in my mind, it's like you have to give context, right?
Mhm.
This is what the number looks like, but understand, right, that these are great students that are going to have a great experience, and like, how do we get together and make sure that they stick, right? Or, you know, just the more education you can provide to people that work in an institution with you about, the process, and where and who and how, I think the better, because then I think people begin to trust you, that that you are working hard, and that you do want them to partner with you, right? That you do value that they are the reason, right? Again, it's not the admissions office. It is the tour guide. It is the faculty. It is the staff. It is the experience that somebody has when they're talking about their financial aid. Oh, by the way, not just when they're thinking about coming there, but what does that look like all 4 years when that may change, right? Um, I think it's really just, how does an institution support not only the prospective students, but the incoming students and the faculty and staff, and how do they create that environment where everybody feels like we are in this together, right? Like, we are all looking to do our best work because we believe in the mission, we believe in the place, right?
Yeah, I think that's the dream, and like
Dream.
yeah, rocky roads ahead. So I think it's also, like you said, let's look at the numbers. Let's look at what reality is showing us, and not bury our heads in the sand. Um, but know that if we get through this, we will be different. We will be better. We'll be better suited for the future. We'll be better aligned around our mission and our values, and our, you know, our vision for where we're trying to go, and the way we're trying to change these kids' lives, or these students' lives. Um, so I do think it's just a scary time. So I certainly, we can sit here and pontificate, but I also have a lot of empathy for folks that are in these positions as well internally.
Yeah, it is the hardest job. I think
Yeah,
the only thing that might be harder is folks that are in development, right?
yeah,
um, yeah.
hard too, and a lot more counting on development these days. A lot more pressure on
Yeah,
them.
because if you are realistic, you do have a realistic idea about what your numbers are going to look like. And so, you cannot necessarily turn things around in a year or on the back of admission for a lot of schools, right? But that's so hard, right? Like, that's the challenge for development, right? Because how many people are like, well, I'm not going to give until I know that this place is going to make it. And you're like, if you don't give, we might not make it. Like, you have to have that leap of faith, right? So that, I think, is probably the only job where I think, whew, that might even be more aggressive than enrollment. Because again, right, like, what do you say to somebody who's like, well, I'm going to just wait and see, if you guys can get the numbers in, and you're like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I just wanted to say thank you for this conversation. It's been a pleasure, getting to work with you briefly, and getting to talk to you about all of this. And from your perspective, I think there's just a wealth of experience and knowledge, and perspective on all the challenges that are going on right now. And so I think a lot of people will be excited to hear your take on things. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I can't even tell you what a pleasure it is anytime somebody lets me geek out on enrollment. I'm happy to do it.
All right.
For
Well, we'll have to
yeah.
do it again soon then.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Bridget.
So much.